Chapter 1: Splinters and Strategies. The splinter felt like a tooth in her palm. Aria didn't flinch. She just kept wiping the sticky rings of ale from the table, her knuckles grazing the rough-hewn wood. Around her, the pack hall was a storm of noise, booming laughter, the clatter of plates, the stench of sweat and roasting meat. It was the sound of her cage. Alpha Jorik, a man whose gut preceded him like a declaration of importance, slammed his tankard down. A fresh spray of foam hit her cheek. "More," he grunted, not looking at her. He never looked at her. Omegas were furniture that moved. Aria dipped her head, a silent, practiced gesture of obedience. Her gaze stayed fixed on the floorboards, counting the cracks. It was a game she played, a way to keep the part of her that mattered. Separate. The part that saw Yorick wasn't a mighty alpha, but a blustering fool whose pack was losing territory because he thought with his temper instead of his head. The part of her that knew 3 different ways to retake the northern ridge he'd forfeited last month. That part stayed quiet. It had to, for her father. Because a crippled warrior didn't need the trouble of a daughter with a dangerous mind. She moved toward the barrels, her steps quiet. Her body ached, a deep, familiar ache that had settled into her bones years ago. It was a map of her life here, a line of pain along her ribs from a warrior she'd failed to serve fast enough, a starburst of agony on her shoulder from a fall Jorik hadn't bothered to prevent. The worst pains, however, were the ones no one could see. They were the legacy of her mother, the whispers of a bloodline that was a death sentence, a seer, a strategist, a threat. Later, in the cold sliver of a room she called her own, she finally worked the splinter free with a pin. A single bead of blood welled up, dark as a secret. The world outside her door faded. Here, she wasn't the pack's punching bag. Here, she was something else entirely. From beneath a loose floorboard, she pulled out a leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled not with girlish dreams, but with maps drawn from memory, with political alliances diagrammed like spider webs, with battle formations sketched in charcoal. Her mother had taught her the game of strategy before the sickness took her. "Never let them see your mind, little bird," she had whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "It's the only part of you they can't break." Aria's fingers traced a plan to defend their eastern border, a pincer movement so simple, so elegant, Jorik would never conceive of it. A phantom ache throbbed behind her eyes. A vision, no, just a memory of a warning. A flash of silver and a gasp of pain. It was happening more often lately, these flickers of something. Was this what her mother had felt? This dreadful knowing? A sharp rap on her door shattered the quiet. "Omega! The Alpha wants you. Now!" Her blood went cold. She shoved the journal back into its hiding place, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. What had she done? Yorick never summoned her personally unless it was for a punishment. She smoothed down her tunic, her hands trembling slightly, and composed her face into a mask of placid emptiness. She opened the door. Jorik stood there, his face flushed with a rare, agitated excitement. "You're coming with me. To the capital." He spat the words out. "We've been summoned by the king himself over the border dispute." He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in like claws. "You will be silent. You will be invisible. If you bring me any shame, I will snap your useless neck myself." The cage was about to get much, much bigger. Chapter 2: The Marble and the Memory. The silence in the Alpha King's throne room was a weapon. It was heavier than steel, sharper than any blade. King Kael Draven sat on a throne carved from obsidian, a seat as unyielding and cold as his reputation. He listened, his face an unreadable mask of stone, as a nobleman droned on about grain shipments and territorial squabbles. The man's voice trembled, each word a desperate plea for approval from a king who offered none. Kael lifted a single finger. The nobleman's voice died in his throat. The entire court held its breath. "Lord Valerius," Kael's voice was low, a rumble that seemed to come from the very foundations of the castle. It wasn't loud, but it filled every corner of the vast hall. You have wasted 10 minutes of my time to tell me that your own incompetence has led to a predictable shortage. You are a leader. Lead, or be replaced. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The threat hung in the air, more potent than any shout. Leave, and do not bring me such trivialities again. Lord Valerius bowed so low his forehead nearly touched the marble floor, his face pale with sweat and fear. He practically scrambled from the room. Kael watched him go, his eyes the color of a stormy winter sky, betraying nothing. He was the king who had killed his own tyrant father to take the throne, the alpha who did not forgive, the man who did not love. Every person in this room believed it. It was crucial that they did. Because power built on fear was stable. Power built on affection, that was a vulnerability he could never afford again. He dismissed the court with a wave of his hand. They fled like mice from a hawk. Alone, the weight of the crown he didn't physically wear settled on his shoulders. The throne room, once a stage for his ruthless performance, became a vast empty mausoleum. He walked to a high-arched window overlooking the silent gardens, the moonlight painting everything in shades of silver and black. He spoke to the emptiness. They are all so afraid, Lyra. The name was a whisper, a ghost on his lips, a name no one in this palace had dared to speak for 5 years. He could almost see her standing in the moonlight, her laughter like wind chimes, her scent, wildflowers and summer rain, a phantom fragrance that still haunted his dreams. He had been so sure she was his mate, the one the moon goddess had chosen for him. I rule them with an iron fist, just as you said I must. His hand clenched on the cold stone of the windowsill. But you never told me how empty the throne would be. The ambush had been meant for him. The assassins his father's loyalists had sent. But it was Lyra who had fallen, the light in her eyes extinguished while he was still fighting his way to her side. The moon goddess had given him a gift, only to rip it away. It was a betrayal he would never forgive. Since that day, his heart had been a locked, barren room. A knock echoed from the great doors. His aide, Bram, entered, his steps hesitant. Your Majesty, the delegation from the Blackwood Pack has arrived. Their alpha, Jorik, requests an audience tomorrow regarding the border claim. Kael turned from the window, the mask of the ruthless king sliding perfectly back into place. The ghost of his past was banished. The pain was buried. Let them wait, he commanded, his voice once again solid ice. Let them contemplate their insignificance. He needed to see if this pack leader was a fool or a threat. Little did he know, the greatest threat wasn't the alpha at all. Chapter 3. The Shadow of the Crown. The journey was a miserable affair. Aria sat hunched in the back of a rattling cart, the wind a sharp knife against her skin. Every jolt of the wheels sent a spike of pain through her bruised ribs. Alpha Jorik rode ahead on his horse, his broad back a wall of contempt. He hadn't spoken another word to her since his threat, but his anger radiated backward, a foul-smelling cloud that choked the air. She was a tool he was forced to bring, a symbol of his pack's complete roster, nothing more. He thought she was a simpleton, a weak, useless Omega. Good. That's what kept her alive. As a result of his simmering rage, she kept her head down, focusing instead on the changing landscape. The familiar, dense woods of her home territory gave way to rolling hills and manicured fields. Everything here was tamed, controlled. It was the king's land. Even the air felt different, heavier, charged with an ancient and unforgiving power. She could smell it, the scent of ozone, old stone, and something else. Something wild and primal that lay coiled beneath the surface of all this order. Then she saw it. The capital rose from the plains like a jawbone of dark mountains. Towers pierced the clouds, their peaks sharp against the gray sky. A curtain wall, massive and impregnable, encircled the city, a stone promise of absolute authority. It wasn't a home, it was a fortress. A declaration that the man inside was not to be trifled with. Her strategist's mind, the one she kept locked away, began to work automatically, assessing. She noted the position of the watchtowers, the choke points at the main gate, the clear lines of fire from the ramparts. It was a masterpiece of defensive architecture. It was beautiful, and it terrified her. What kind of man builds such a cage around himself? They were ushered through the gates by guards whose armor was black as midnight, their faces hidden behind visors. They didn't look at Yorick with the deference he commanded at home. They looked through him, their dismissal a quiet, profound insult. The cart rumbled over smooth cobblestones past opulent homes and grim-faced citizens who hurried out of their path. There was no joy here, only order, the oppressive, suffocating order of a king who ruled through fear. Finally, they reached the palace itself. It was a heart of black stone and soaring spires that seemed to drain the very light from the sky. Her breath caught in her throat. This was the center of their world. This was the den of the wolf who ruled all other wolves. Yorick was sweating now, his bluster shrinking with every step they took toward the colossal entrance doors. Inside, the great hall was a cavern of echoes and shadows. Light streamed from high windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like lost souls. Banners bearing the royal crest, a snarling wolf's head crowned with iron, hung from the rafters, silent and watchful. A handful of nobles milled about, their fine clothes a stark contrast to Aria's worn tunic. They glanced at Yorick's party with open disdain. A border alpha and his chattel. An official with a face like a sour plum approached them. "Alpha Yorick, the king is occupied. You will wait." It was not a request. Yorick, for the first time in Aria's memory, seemed to shrink. He nodded meekly. They were led to a bench along the wall to wait like beggars at a feast. Aria sat, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes downcast. But behind her mask of submission, her mind was racing, cataloging every detail, every person, every scent. The air smelled of power, of old blood, and of a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical chill. This place wasn't just a palace, it was a tomb, and she was about to meet the ghost who haunted it. Chapter 4. The spark in the silence time seemed to stretch and thin in the great hall. Alpha Yorick stood before the obsidian throne, his voice a weak, whining drone that failed to reach the high, shadowed rafters. He spoke of pack honor, of ancient claims, of slights and injustices. But his words were hollow, his arguments circular and pathetic. He was a dog yapping at the heels of a lion, and every soul in the room knew it. Aria, standing behind him and to the left, felt a hot, sickening wave of shame wash over her. This was her alpha. This fool represented her home. He was butchering their claim. He confused dates, mixed up bloodlines, and presented his case with the grace of a drunken bear. From the throne, King Kael watched, his expression unchanged. He didn't move. He barely seemed to breathe. Yet his stillness was more terrifying than any rage. It was the calm at the center of a hurricane. It was the absolute certainty of a predator that has already won. Yorick finally stammered to a halt, his weak argument dissolving into a mumble. The silence that followed was immense, crushing. It was in that deafening quiet, as her alpha's failure hung in the air like a foul stench, that Aria's control finally frayed. The strategist in her, the girl who had spent 1,000 nights dissecting maps and tactics, could not bear the sheer idiocy of it all. A whisper escaped her lips, barely a breath, not meant for anyone. If brains were weapons, our alpha wouldn't survive a spar with a pup. It was the quietest sound in the world, and it shattered the silence like a thunderclap. Every head in the hall swiveled. Every eye, shocked, horrified, gleeful, landed on her, on the Omega. Yorick's face went from pale to a blotchy, terrified red. He looked at her as if she had just sprouted a second head and started screaming prophecies. Aria's blood turned to ice in her veins. Oh, goddess. What had she done? Her mind, the one thing her mother told her to hide, had just signed her own death warrant. She braced herself for the blow, for the king's order that would end her life. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the order never came. Instead, she felt a change in the air, a shift in the pressure of the room. Slowly, she forced her eyes open. The nobles, the guards, her own alpha. She didn't see them. She only saw him. The king had leaned forward, just an inch, but the movement was a tectonic shift. His stormy eyes were no longer surveying the room. They were fixed on her. They weren't angry. They were intrigued. A flicker of something sharp and analytical burned in their depths. He saw her. For the first time, a person of power was truly seeing her. His voice, when it came, was not a roar of fury. It was a low, deliberate command that sliced through the tension and sealed her fate. The Blackwood pack may leave. He paused, his gaze never leaving Aria's. The Omega stays. Chapter 5. The King's Sentence. Panic was a living thing, a frantic bird beating its wings against the cage of her ribs. Aria watched as Alpha Jorik, after a moment of stunned disbelief, bowed low and practically ran from the hall. Her pack followed, not one of them daring to cast a backward glance at her. They were leaving her, abandoning her in the lion's den without a second thought. The great oak doors boomed shut, the sound echoing like a final judgment. The click of the latch was the sound of her old life ending. She was alone, trapped, with him. The remaining nobles and guards melted away at some unseen signal from their king, their movements silent and swift. Soon, the vast hall was empty, save for two figures, the king on his throne of night, and the Omega on the floor of cold marble. The space between them felt like a mile-wide chasm. Aria's every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to make herself small enough to disappear. But she was frozen, pinned in place by the sheer force of his presence. Then he moved. He rose from his throne, not with the creak of an old ruler, but with a fluid, predatory grace that was utterly silent. He descended the dais, his black leather boots making no sound on the stone. He was taller than she'd imagined, broader. The air grew colder as he approached, and a scent reached her, not of cloying perfumes, but of winter frost, of clean iron, and something wilder, something like the smell of a storm just before it breaks. He stopped a few feet in front of her, looking down. His shadow fell over her, a tangible weight. "You have a name?" His voice was calm. It was the most terrifying thing she had ever heard. "Aria," she whispered, her own voice sounding thin and weak. "Aria." He tested the name, tasting it. "You believe your alpha is a fool." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. She couldn't speak. A nod was all she could manage, a tiny, jerky movement. "Fools with power are a blight," Kael murmured, his eyes studying her face, not with lust or contempt, but with an unnerving, analytical curiosity. He was taking her apart with his gaze, trying to see the workings of her mind. They cause instability. They lose territory. They invite war. He was echoing the very thoughts from her journal. "You see this. An Omega sees this." He began to circle her slowly, and she had to fight the urge to flinch away. "Your defiance is unusual. Insubordination in my hall is typically rewarded with a swift death. So I ask myself, why did you speak? Were you seeking death?" "No," she finally managed, the word catching in her dry throat. "No," he repeated softly. "Then you are either a fool yourself, or you possess a mind you have no right to." He stopped in front of her again. "I have decided that a swift death would be a waste. Your punishment will be far more instructive." Aria braced herself for pain, for humiliation, for a lifetime of servitude in the palace's filthiest kitchens. "You have a strategist's mind trapped in the body of a servant," the king declared, his voice leaving no room for argument. "A sharp blade left to rust is a sin. So you will be my personal scribe. You will sit in my study, you will read my correspondence, you will listen to my counsel, and you will learn the difference between the braying of a fool and the will of a king. Your sentence, Aria, is an education. Chapter 6. The War of Words. The king's study was a cage made of knowledge. Bookshelves stretched from the floor to the vaulted ceiling, crammed with scrolls and leather-bound tomes that smelled of dust and time. A fire crackled in a hearth large enough to roast a boar, casting dancing shadows over maps tacked to the walls and weapons gleaming on their racks. It was a room that hummed with quiet, lethal power. Aria sat at a small desk near the fire, a quill in her hand, her back ramrod straight. The warmth from the flames couldn't touch the chill deep inside her. Kael paced before the fire, not with agitation, but with the restless energy of a caged wolf. He hadn't spoken a word to her since she'd been brought here an hour ago. He was dictating. A trade decree for the southern packs. His voice was a low, steady rumble, each word precise, each sentence a carefully forged link in a chain of command. Aria's quill scratched across the parchment, her hand moving automatically. She was trying to focus only on the words, on the shape of the letters, on anything but the man who was the sole other occupant of the room. But her mind, her traitorous mind, was listening. It was analyzing. And it found a flaw. And the tax on all timber shipments from the Sunstone Pack will be increased by 1/5, effective at the next full moon, he concluded. Aria's quill stilled. Her heart gave a painful thud. She shouldn't. It was madness. It was suicide. She had survived once by a miracle. A second act of defiance would surely be her last. She squeezed her eyes shut. Be invisible. Be silent. Is there a problem, scribe? His voice was dangerously soft. He had stopped pacing. She opened her eyes. He was watching her, his stormy gaze narrowed. He'd noticed her pause. Of course, he had. This king noticed everything. No, Your Majesty, she said, her voice tight. Do not lie to me, he snapped, the sound like stone striking steel. I can smell deceit. Your heart rate quickened. You stopped writing. There is a problem. Speak it. The command was absolute. The silence stretched. It was the Great Hall all over again, but this time it was worse. It was intimate. Taking a shaky breath, she found her voice. The Sunstone Pack. They don't just supply timber, Your Majesty. Their territory contains the only viable quartz quarry this side of the mountains. They trade that quartz to the Silvercrest Pack, who in turn use it to craft the weapons your own royal guard prefers. Kael's expression didn't change, but a new light entered his eyes, a flicker of genuine attention. If you tax their primary exports so heavily, she continued, the words tumbling out now that they had started, they will raise the price of their secondary resource, the quartz, to make up the deficit. The Silvercrest Pack will pass that cost on to you. You will be, in effect, paying for your own tax. You will gain nothing, and you will anger 2 loyal packs in the process. She finished, her chest heaving, expecting him to explode, expecting him to call the guards. Instead, he was silent for a long time. The only sound was the crackle and hiss of the fire. He walked to the massive map on the wall, his eyes tracing the borders she had just described. Bring me the decree, he commanded. Her hands trembling, Aria stood and carried the wet parchment to him. He took it from her, his fingers brushing hers. A jolt, hot and sharp, shot up her arm. She flinched back as if burned. Kael's gaze flicked to her, then back to the page. With a single, decisive motion, he strode to the fireplace and tossed the parchment into the flames. It curled, blackened, and vanished into ash. We will begin again, was all he said, turning back to face her. But the air in the room had changed forever. It was no longer the king and his Omega scribe. It was a game of strategy, and he had just acknowledged her as a player. Chapter 7. Whispers in the Stone Days. In the royal palace bled into one another, each measured by the silent ticking of a grand clock in the main hall and the shifting slant of light through the study's tall windows. Aria's life had found a new, terrifying rhythm. She would wake in a small but comfortable room, a chamber far grander than her hovel back home, and be escorted to the king's study. There she would work, her world shrinking to the confines of that single book-lined room. She researched treaties, transcribed letters, and organized military reports. She became a shadow at the king's side, a silent repository for the secrets of his kingdom. And she learned. Oh, how she learned. She saw the intricate web of alliances and rivalries that held the pacts together. She saw the delicate balance of power, the constant threat of famine and war. And she saw the mind of the man who managed it all. Their arguments became a daily ritual, a clash of intellects that was as thrilling as it was dangerous. He would propose a strategy, and she, forgetting her place, would find the flaw. He would counter, his voice a low growl of challenge, and she would defend her position with a logic that was irrefutable. He never praised her, but he started to listen. This newfound, not favor, but utility, did not go unnoticed. Outside the sanctuary of the study, the palace was a sea of venomous whispers and cold assessing stares. The nobles, accustomed to a clear hierarchy, did not know what to make of her. The king's pet Omega, a curiosity, a plaything, a threat. They saw a servant who had risen above her station, and their jealousy was a palpable thing, a bitter perfume in the air. One man's hatred was more open than the rest. Lord Malachor, the king's chief advisor, was a tall, gaunt wolf with eyes like chips of obsidian. He never spoke to her directly, but his gaze followed her everywhere, filled with a cold fire that promised pain. He saw her not as a curiosity, but as an infection in the court, a disruption to the order he had so carefully curated. She could feel his animosity like a physical pressure, a warning that her precarious position could shatter at any moment. One afternoon, while searching for a scroll in the royal library, she overheard two ladies of the court, their voices sharp as glass. "He lets her speak in council," one hissed, hidden by a tall shelf. "It's a disgrace," the other replied. "An Omega, advising the king. What does she know of our ways? My brother says the Alpha King has been unwell ever since—" The voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "Lyra." The name hung in the air, heavy and forbidden. Aria froze, her hand hovering over a scroll. That was the name from the king's private torment, the ghost in his heart. "Hush," the First Lady cautioned. "Walls have ears, but mark my words, that little border wolf will be the king's ruin. Someone ought to put her back in her place." A cold dread trickled down Aria's spine. She was a pawn in a game she didn't understand, surrounded by enemies she couldn't fight. Her only shield was the baffling protection of a ruthless king who might discard her the moment she ceased to be useful. She was no safer here than she had been at home. She had simply traded a brute's cage for a gilded one full of snakes. Chapter 8. A King's Growl. Kael insisted she attend the midwinter gala. Aria knew it was a test, a way to see how she would conduct herself among the vipers of his court. She stood near a marble pillar, dressed in a simple but elegant gown of deep blue that the king's servants had provided. The fabric was softer than anything she had ever touched, yet it felt like armor that was 2 sizes too small. The grand ballroom was a dizzying kaleidoscope of color and sound, the swirl of silk gowns, the flash of jewels, the lilt of string music, and the constant buzzing drone of hundreds of conversations. It was overwhelming, a sensory assault designed to disorient and intimidate. She tried to make herself invisible, a tactic that had served her well for years. But she was no longer invisible. She was the king's Omega. Courtiers would pass, their gazes lingering on her with a mixture of contempt and curiosity. They saw her as an exotic pet, a strange new toy the tempestuous king had acquired. A young, handsome lord with slicked back hair and an arrogant smirk detached himself from a group and sauntered toward her. She recognized him from court, Lord Paradin, a notorious gossip with a cruel streak. "Well, well," he began, his voice oily and loud enough for those nearby to hear. "The little stray, all cleaned up. Does our great king truly let you sit at his table, or do you eat scraps from the floor like a good little Omega should?" Aria's jaw tightened, but she kept her gaze fixed on a point over his shoulder. "I have no quarrel with you, my lord." "Oh, but I think you do," he purred, stepping closer, invading her space. He was playing to his audience, seeking to humiliate her to elevate his own standing. "You forget your place. Perhaps you need a reminder of how things work." Before she could react, he reached out and wrapped his fingers around her arm, his touch both a caress and a threat. "In my lands, we teach our Omegas proper." He never finished the sentence. From across the room, a sound cut through the music and the chatter. It wasn't a shout. It was a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the very floorboards. It was a sound of pure, primal possession, a promise of violence so profound that the entire ballroom fell instantly silent. Every head turned, not to Paradin, but to the throne on its dais where King Kael sat watching, his face a mask of cold fury. His eyes were locked on Paradin's hand on Aria's arm, and in their stormy depths, a murder was brewing. Lord Paradin froze, his face draining of all color, his hand snatched back from her arm as if he'd been burned. He was trembling, his eyes wide with a terror so absolute it was a physical thing. He couldn't even manage an apology. He simply stumbled backward, melting into the crowd that parted for him like the sea. The music slowly, hesitantly, started up again. The conversations resumed, but they were now hushed, furtive whispers. Kael hadn't moved. He hadn't said a word. He didn't have to. The message had been sent to the entire kingdom. The Omega was his, and to touch her was to invite death. Aria stood by the pillar, her heart hammering against her ribs, her skin still tingling where Paradin had touched her. She wasn't an invisible servant anymore. She was a territory, and its king was watching. Chapter 9. The space between the air and the study was always thick with tension, but tonight it was a suffocating blanket. A storm raged outside the castle, mirroring the one brewing within the stone walls of the room. Aria and Kael were arguing over a border patrol route, but the debate was no longer purely strategic. It had become personal. He called her analysis reckless. She called his caution cowardice. "You see everything as a threat to be bludgeoned into submission," she accused, her voice rising. She stood across the massive oak desk from him, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "There are other ways to rule. Through loyalty, not just fear." "Loyalty is a luxury I cannot afford," Kael shot back, rising to his full height. The firelight cast his face in harsh angles, making him look more like a predator than a king. "It is a weakness my enemies would exploit in a heartbeat, a lesson you have clearly not learned. Or perhaps it is a strength you are too afraid to grasp." That was the line. She saw it in his eyes, the flash of something raw and wounded beneath the icy fury. In 2 long strides, he was around the desk. Aria took an involuntary step back. Her retreat halted as her back hit a towering bookshelf. He was in front of her, caging her in with his arms braced on the shelves on either side of her head. The world shrank to the space between them. She could feel the heat rolling off his body, smell the scent of rain and ozone on his clothes. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, frantic rhythm. She was trapped, completely and utterly at his mercy. He leaned in close, his face just inches from hers. His stormy eyes bored into hers, searching, demanding. "Why?" he growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through her bones. "Why aren't you afraid of me?" The question hung in the air between them. Every other person in his kingdom trembled at the sight of him. They saw a monster, a tyrant, a killer. But Aria, looking up into the maelstrom of his eyes, saw something else. She saw the ghost of Lyra. She saw the profound loneliness of the man on the throne. She saw the crushing weight of the crown he wore, and her fear simply evaporated. It was replaced by a strange, aching empathy. Her voice, when she answered, was barely a whisper, but it was steady. "Because you're not half as heartless as you pretend." The words hit him like a physical blow. She watched as the fury in his eyes faltered, replaced by a flicker of stunned disbelief. And then something deeper, something vulnerable. The space between them became charged, electric. His gaze dropped to her lips. She saw the pulse beating in the strong column of his throat. Her own breath hitched. He was going to kiss her. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. She wanted him to. Goddess, she wanted it more than her next breath. He leaned closer still, his scent filling her senses, his lips parting slightly. Time stopped. The storm outside held its breath. Then, with a choked sound that was half growl, half groan, he shoved himself away from her as if the bookshelf were red hot. He spun around, his back to her, his hands clenched into fists. "Get out," he bit out, his voice strained and raw. Aria didn't need to be told twice. She fled the room, her whole body trembling, her lips tingling with the ghost of a kiss that had never happened. But the question remained, burning in the air he'd left behind. What would he do now that she had seen past his armor? Chapter 10. Plots and Prophecies. An invisible wall now stood between Aria and the king. After the night in the study, after that raw, unspoken moment, something had shifted. He was colder than ever. His commands were clipped, his gaze distant, and the easy fire of their debates had been extinguished, replaced by a tense, brittle silence. He was pushing her away, and she had no idea why. It left an ache in her chest, a hollow space where that strange, dangerous connection had been. This new coldness was worse than his anger. It was a dismissal, and it hurt more than she cared to admit. The court, sensing the shift in the king's attitude, grew bolder. The whispers followed her like wasps, buzzing with malice. Lord Malacor's stare was now tinged with a smug triumph. He believed her time was running out. She was at a council meeting, quietly taking notes as instructed, when she saw him speaking with Lord Paradin, the arrogant noble who had accosted her at the gala. Malacor's hand rested briefly on Paradin's shoulder, a gesture of alliance. His lips moved in a low murmur, but Aria saw a flash of silver pass from the advisor's hand to the young lord's. A coin? No, it was too flat. It was a sigil of some kind, a silver serpent biting its own tail. Aria's blood ran cold. The image struck her with the force of a physical blow. It was from her dream. That thought had barely formed when another image flooded her mind, unbidden. A dagger, a serpent-crested hilt, a flash of movement in a crowd, the king's unsuspecting back. She gasped, a small, choked sound. "Is something wrong, scribe?" Kael's voice cut through the haze, sharp and irritated. Aria looked up, her heart pounding. The vision faded, leaving her breathless and shaking. Every eye at the council table was on her. Malachor was watching her with a sharp, calculating glint. He knew she'd seen something. "No, Your Majesty," she managed, her voice trembling. A cramp in my hand." The lie was flimsy, pathetic. Kael's eyes narrowed in disbelief before he dismissed her with a wave. That night, sleep offered no escape. She was plunged back into the dream, but it was clearer this time, more real. She saw the grand hall, filled with people for a feast. She saw the serpent dagger in an assassin's hand. She saw it fly through the air, aimed directly at an unsuspecting Kael. But then, in the dream, she was moving. She was throwing herself in its path. The dream ended with a searing, white-hot pain in her side and the king's horrified face looming over her. She woke with a cry. clutching her side where the phantom blade had struck. It wasn't a memory. It wasn't just a nightmare. It was a warning. Her mother's gift, or curse, was awakening inside her, and it was showing her a future written in blood. A plot was in motion, orchestrated by the king's most trusted advisor. And somehow, she was at the center of it. She was no longer just a pawn in their game. She was a sacrifice waiting to be made. She had to warn him. But how could she make the king listen to the prophetic ravings of an Omega he now refused to even look at? Chapter 11, The Unwanted Bond. Kael slammed his practice sword against the shield of his training partner, the jarring impact vibrating up his arms. He fought with a cold, controlled fury, his movements precise and deadly. Sweat dripped from his brow, but he felt nothing. Not the burn in his muscles, not the ache in his bones. He was trying to exhaust himself, to beat back the thoughts that had plagued him since that night in the study. The image of Aria, cornered and defiant, her scent of parchment and wild herbs filling his senses. Her whispered words that had seen straight through his armor. It was a dangerous weakness, one he had to purge. He disarmed his opponent with a brutal, efficient twist and called a halt to the session. He needed air. Striding toward the battlements that overlooked the palace gardens, he breathed in the crisp autumn air, hoping it would clear his head. And then he saw her. Aria was in the gardens below, walking along a path of white gravel. She wasn't looking his way. She was tracing the petals of a late-blooming rose, her expression lost in thought. The afternoon sun caught in her dark hair, creating a halo of light around her. She looked small from this distance, fragile. And in that instant, the world tilted on its axis. It wasn't a thought. It wasn't a feeling. It was a cataclysm. A golden thread, invisible but immensely powerful, snapped taut between them, pulling at the very center of his soul. Her scent, not the faint fragrance from memory, but her true scent, flooded him. A dizzying rush of wild herbs, clean parchment, and something else. Something that was hers alone. It was a scent that screamed one irrefutable word in the core of his being. Mate. The realization hit him not with joy, but with the force of a physical blow. He staggered back, his hand flying to his chest as if to stop his heart from clawing its way out. No, not again. The moon goddess wouldn't be so cruel. She wouldn't give him a second chance only to mock him with an Omega, a scribe, a girl whose sharp mind was a tempting flame in the darkness, but whose body was breakable, whose station was nothing. A girl who would be a target for every enemy he had. A wave of pure, undiluted rage washed over him, hot and blinding. The ghost of Lyra rose in his memory, her dying gasp a fresh wound in his soul. Love was a vulnerability, a fatal one. He had learned that lesson in blood and agony. To accept this bond, to let himself feel anything for this girl, would be to paint a target on her back. It would be a death sentence just like it had been for Lyra. He would not make that mistake again. He would not be the cause of another mate's death. His grief and his fury twisted into a cold, hard resolve. This bond wasn't a gift. It was a curse. A weakness he had to cut out before it could fester. He looked down at Aria again, his face setting into a mask of grim determination. He would protect her, and the only way to do that was to become the monster she didn't believe he was. He would have to push her away, break her spirit, do whatever it took to make her hate him, and then he would have to destroy the very thing that tied them together. Chapter 12. A Rejection in Moonlight. His cruelty became his shield. In the days that followed, Kael was relentlessly, brutally cold to Aria. He criticized her work over trivialities. He dismissed her strategic insights with a contemptuous wave. He spoke to her only when necessary, his voice a blade of ice designed to cut her to the quick. He watched the hurt and confusion cloud her eyes, and each flicker of pain he caused was a fresh torment to his own soul. It was a necessary evil. He was breaking her heart to save her life. It was a king's calculation, cold and absolute, but it felt like self-mutilation. The bond, however, refused to be ignored. It was a constant low hum beneath his skin, a phantom warmth that flared whenever she was near. At night he dreamed of her, and the connection between them was a vibrant, living thing. He would wake in a cold sweat, the ghost of her touch on his skin, his resolve wavering. He couldn't go on like this. He had to end it, permanently. There was a way, an old way, a terrible soul-splintering ritual that was spoken of only in whispers. A rejection. To sever a true mate bond was said to be like tearing one's own soul in half. Many who attempted it went mad from the grief. But Kael was not like other wolves. His heart was already a wasteland of scar tissue. What was one more wound? That night, under the cold, indifferent light of a full moon, he left the castle. He rode to a clearing deep in the royal woods, a place of ancient power marked by a circle of standing stones. The air here was thin and silent, heavy with the weight of forgotten magic. This was where his ancestors had come to commune with the goddess. Tonight, he had come to defy her. He stepped into the center of the circle. The moonlight pooled around him, cool and white. From a pouch at his belt, he removed a small, silver-bladed knife. This was the part he dreaded. The ritual required a blood offering, a symbol of the life he was refusing to share. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the scent of damp earth and crushed moon-petal flowers filling his lungs. He thought of Aria's face, of her defiant eyes, of the warmth he had felt in her presence. He was doing this for her, to keep her safe from him. I, Kael Draven, Alpha King of the Great Packs, he began, his voice rough and strained in the sacred silence. Stand before the moon goddess, and I renounce her gift. He raised the knife. The bond she has forged. I reject it. He sliced the blade across his palm. Blood, dark in the moonlight, welled up and dripped onto the cold, hard earth. A surge of agony, sharp and blinding, ripped through him. It was not the pain of the cut. It was the feeling of that golden thread connecting him to Aria being stretched, frayed, and then snapping. A part of him went dark. A part of him died. He fell to his knees, a guttural cry of pure anguish torn from his throat. The clearing was silent once more. The moon watched on, impassive. The bond was broken. He was finally, utterly alone. And the emptiness was a chasm that threatened to swallow him whole. Chapter 13. The Unbroken. It began as a shiver, a sudden, inexplicable coldness that seeped into her bones, leaving her feeling hollowed out, as if some vital part of her had been scooped away. The feeling coincided with the king's change. His cruelty was no longer a shield, it was a honed weapon. He ignored her insights, mocked her handwriting, and spoke to her with a chilling formality that was more painful than any physical blow. He was trying to break her. She could feel the deliberate, crushing pressure of his will, pushing her down, trying to force her back into the role of a meek, silent Omega. A week ago, it might have worked. A week ago, she was a girl who flinched from shadows and prayed for invisibility. But something inside her had changed. She had tasted respect in their arguments. She had felt the spark of connection in his study. She had seen the man behind the monster, and his attempts to erase that memory now, to deny what had passed between them, did not shatter her. It infuriated her. The pain of his rejection didn't curdle into despair. It hardened into a cold, diamond-sharp rage. A quiet rebellion began to bloom in the barren space he had created in her chest. He thought she was weak. He thought his approval was the sun she needed to grow. He was wrong. She had survived Yorick's fists and his pack's contempt. She would survive this king's coldness, and then she would be free of it. All of it. The decision settled over her, not with fear, but with a profound and liberating certainty. She would leave. She would escape this gilded cage, disappear into the wider world, and build a life where her worth wasn't determined by an alpha's whim or a king's mood. She would be her own. Her planning was meticulous. A strategist's mind, once used to devise battle plans for others, was now focused on a single objective: her own liberation. She began to save slivers of bread and dried meat from her meals, wrapping them in cloth and hiding them in a small satchel beneath her mattress. She studied the guards' patrol routes, noting the patterns, the moments of distraction at the changing of the shifts. She stole a small, sharp paring knife from the kitchens, the cold steel in her palm a comforting promise of self-reliance. Each small act of defiance was a balm to her wounded spirit. Each stolen item, each memorized route, was a stitch reknitting the parts of her soul he had tried to tear apart. Kael watched her, his stormy eyes missing nothing. He saw her quiet dignity, her unbowed head, the way she met his icy glares without flinching. He likely saw it as stubbornness, an Omega's foolish pride. He had no idea he was watching a prisoner plan her escape. He thought he was pushing her into a corner. He was really pushing her toward the door, and soon she would be ready to walk through it. Chapter 14. A Kingdom for a Kiss. The castle was asleep. A deep, profound silence lay over the stone corridors, broken only by the distant footsteps of a lone guard and the whisper of the wind against the high battlements. This was her chance. Aria moved like a ghost, her bare feet making no sound on the cold floor. The small satchel with her meager supplies was tied at her waist, the stolen knife tucked securely in her belt. Her heart was a frantic drum, a wild counterpoint to the sleeping fortress around her. Fear was a bitter taste in her mouth, but freedom was a sweeter promise. She reached a side passage, one she'd noted was rarely used after midnight. It led to the kitchens and, from there, to a small postern gate. She flattened herself into the shadows of a tapestry, listening. Nothing. She was about to slip into the passage when a figure materialized from the deeper darkness ahead. Her breath caught in her throat. It was Kael. He wasn't in his regal attire. He wore a simple black tunic and trousers, but his presence was as overwhelming as ever. He stood there, blocking her path, his arms crossed over his chest. He was not surprised. He had been waiting for her. "And where?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous murmur that slid through the silence. "Do you think you are going?" "Away from here," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. She would not cower. Not anymore. "This palace is your home now," he stated, a cold finality in his tone. "This palace is my prison," she shot back, her new, hard-won resolve making her brave. "And you are my jailer. I will not be your pet, your project, or your whipping post. I am leaving." He took a step closer, and another. The predator was closing in. "I forbid it." "You can't forbid me from wanting to be free." "I can," he growled, now standing directly in front of her. His scent, winter and a desperate, raw agony she couldn't place, enveloped her. "You are mine. You will stay." That broke the last of her restraint. "Yours?" she scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping her. "You've spent weeks treating me like dirt beneath your boot. You look at me with disgust. You speak to me with contempt. You cannot have it both ways, Your Majesty. You cannot discard me and keep me in the same breath." The truth of her words struck him. She saw his cold mask crack, saw the raw desperation clawing its way to the surface. The thought of her walking out that gate, of her disappearing from his life forever, it was destroying him. "I did it to protect you," he choked out, the words sounding torn from his soul. "Protect me from what? Your kindness?" He didn't answer with words. He answered with a roar of pure, frustrated anguish and surged forward. His hands tangled in her hair, tilting her head back. His other arm wrapped around her waist, slamming her body against his. And then his mouth was on hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a raw, desperate claiming. A battle, a confession. It was the howl of a soul in torment, a desperate attempt to reclaim something he had tried to destroy. And then it happened. The moment his lips touched hers, a bolt of pure lightning shot through Aria. The hollowed-out, frozen part of her soul exploded into white-hot life. The bond, the broken, rejected thing, flared back into existence, 1,000 times stronger, a searing, undeniable wave of power and heat and him. It was everything. It was terrifying, and there was no turning back. Chapter 15, The Trial by Moonlight. The kiss had changed everything. The wall between them was gone, shattered into 1,000,000 pieces, and in its place was a crackling, chaotic energy they both struggled to understand. Kael no longer pushed her away. Instead, he kept her close, a possessive, simmering intensity in his every glance. He was a storm holding its breath, and the entire court could feel the shift in the air. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. The king was no longer merely intrigued by the Omega. He was obsessed. This obsession made him careless. It made him a target. And his enemies, seeing the chink in his armor, chose that moment to strike. Lord Malachor made his move in a full session of the court. He stood before the throne, his gaunt face a mask of false piety and concern. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice ringing with supposed loyalty. "The court has noticed your particular interest in the Omega, Aria. While your heart is your own, the stability of the kingdom must be our paramount concern." Kael's hand tightened on the arm of his throne. "Get to your point, Malachor." "There are laws, Your Majesty, ancient laws, designed to protect the purity and strength of our leadership," the advisor continued, his eyes gleaming. "An Omega has never stood so close to the throne. The Pax are unsettled. They question her influence. They question her worth." He let the words hang in the air, poisoning the room. "Therefore, to quell these dangerous rumors and reaffirm the strength of your rule, I invoke the right of judgment. I demand that Aria prove herself in the trial by moonlight." A collective gasp went through the hall. The trial by moonlight. Aria had only read of it in the oldest texts. It wasn't a trial. It was a death sentence, a series of impossible tasks designed to humiliate and destroy anyone who undertook them. It hadn't been invoked in centuries. Kael rose to his feet, his face a thundercloud of pure fury. "You dare," he snarled, his voice a low promise of death. "I dare to protect this kingdom and your throne even from you," Malachor said smoothly, bowing his head. He had laid the perfect trap. If Kael refused, he would appear weak, a king ruled by his affection for an unworthy pet. It would give his enemies the exact ammunition they needed to declare him unfit. He would be forced to either sacrifice Aria or risk a civil war. All eyes turned to Aria. She saw the triumph in Malachor's face, the fear in the faces of a few, and the hungry anticipation in the eyes of many. They were wolves, waiting to see a kill. She looked at Kael. She saw the rage in his eyes, but beneath it, she saw a desperate, trapped fear. Fear for her. In that moment, she knew what she had to do. She could not be his weakness. She had to be his strength. Stepping forward from the shadow of the throne, Aria lifted her chin, her voice ringing out, clear and steady, through the silent hall. "I accept the challenge." The court stared, stunned into silence. Kael looked at her, his expression a mixture of horror and awe. She had just willingly stepped into the executioner's circle, but her face was calm, her gaze resolute. For the first time, she wasn't a scribe or an Omega or a king's possession. She was a warrior choosing her own battlefield. Chapter 16, Trial by Fire and Fang. The first trial was combat. Aria stood in the center of a sand-filled arena, the jeering faces of the court looking down on her. Her opponent was a mountain of a man, a scarred warrior from the king's guard named Hakan. He carried a heavy war axe. She was given a simple staff. The crowd laughed. This was to be a slaughter. Kael watched from the royal dais, his face carved from granite, his knuckles white where he gripped the arms of his throne. Hakan charged, a roar ripping from his chest. Aria did not meet him head-on. That was the fool's path. Instead, she danced back, using the staff not to block, but to deflect. She was a leaf on the wind, always just out of reach of his brutal, cleaving blows. She kicked up sand, momentarily blinding him. While he sputtered, she used the staff to vault onto a stack of barrels left in the arena. He swung his axe, shattering the wood, but she was already gone, dropping behind him to jab the hard end of the staff into the back of his knee. He bellowed in pain and stumbled. She didn't press the attack. She just created distance. She led him on a grueling chase, exhausting him, making him look like a clumsy giant swatting at a fly. Finally, gasping for breath, he dropped to one knee, his axe falling from his numb fingers. He yielded. Aria had won without landing a single disabling blow. She had won with her mind. The second trial was diplomacy. She was brought before a council of 3 hostile elderly lords, their faces sour with tradition and contempt. They peppered her with questions about law, history, and etiquette, their inquiries layered with traps and insults. They expected her to fail, to grovel, to weep. Lord Valerius, the same man Kael had humiliated weeks ago, sneered. "You are an omega of no standing. What gives you the right to breathe the same air as your betters?" Aria met his gaze, her own clear and calm. "The moon goddess gives breath to all her children, my lord, not just the ones who sit on high chairs. She does not measure a wolf's worth by the softness of their seat, but by the strength of their heart." She then turned to the other lords. "You speak of tradition, but you forget the oldest tradition of all, that a pack is only as strong as its most vulnerable member. A kingdom that hoards its strength at the top while its roots starve is a dead tree waiting to fall." She spoke truths they had all forgotten, words that echoed with the wisdom of her mother. They were left speechless, their own hypocrisy exposed. The trial ended in a stunned silence. The final trial was survival. She was taken to the edge of the sacred woods, a dark and ancient place where no one dared to venture. A wild beast, a monstrous black wolf with silver-tipped fur and crazed, hungry eyes, had been terrorizing the domain for months. Not even the king's best hunters could track it. Her task was to face it. They left her at the tree line as dusk fell. The woods were cold and silent. Soon, she heard it. A low growl that was less a sound and more a vibration in the earth. The beast emerged from the shadows, a creature of nightmare. It was huge, its lips peeled back to reveal dagger-like fangs. But in its golden eyes beneath the madness, Aria saw something else. Pain. A deep, festering wound was visible on its flank, an old injury that had never healed properly. It wasn't a monster. It was an animal in agony. Instead of running, Aria slowly sank to her knees. She didn't show aggression, she didn't show fear. She spoke to it in a low, soothing tone, her voice filled with an empathy she hadn't known she possessed. The wolf paused, its head cocked. It took a hesitant step closer. She held out her hand, palm open. It sniffed her, its hot breath washing over her skin. Then, it nudged her hand and gave a soft whine. The court watched from the safety of the tree line, utterly astounded, as the Omega tamed the beast no Alpha could control. She emerged from the woods, victorious, the great wolf trotting calmly at her side. The crowd was silent, their scorn replaced with a new, terrifying respect. As she stepped into the moonlight, a commotion erupted at the edge of the clearing. A group of armed wolves pushed their way forward, led by a single blustering figure. It was Alpha Joric, and he had come to claim his property. Chapter 17. A Debt of Scars. Alpha Joric strode into the clearing, his face a mask of smug ownership. He had brought 24 of his biggest warriors, a pathetic show of force in the face of the king's entire court. "I am here for what is mine," he bellowed, pointing a thick finger at Aria. "The Omega belongs to the Blackwood Pack. She will return with me. Now." The court erupted in chaos. Malachor watched with a smug smile, his plan to destabilize the king proceeding perfectly. Kael's face was a mask of thunderous rage, but he was trapped. Yorick was technically within his rights to petition for the return of a pack member. To deny him outright without cause would be seen as tyranny. He looked at Aria, his eyes a storm of conflict. He silently offered her the choice. It was her past. It was her fight. Aria felt the eyes of the world on her. She looked at Yorick, the man who had allowed her to be beaten and starved, the man who saw her as less than a dog. She saw all the years of pain, of humiliation, of forced silence. A cold, clean calm settled over her. She turned and walked to the nearest royal guard, his face a mask of shock. "Your spear," she said, her voice quiet but firm. The guard was so stunned he simply handed it to her. She tested the weight of the weapon. It felt good in her hands. Balanced. Deadly. She turned and walked toward Yorick, her steps steady and deliberate. The great black wolf at her side let out a low growl, a warning to Yorick's men not to interfere. "You are right, Alpha," she said, her voice carrying across the silent clearing. "I do belong to the Blackwood pack, and as a member of your pack I have the right to challenge my Alpha for his cruelty and incompetence." Yorick's face went pale. "You dare. I dare," she said, and then she moved. She wasn't the dancing leaf from the arena. She was a striking viper. She lunged forward, the spear a blur of motion. Yorick fumbled for his own blade, but he was slow, soft, and unprepared. Her strike was perfect. The spearhead pierced his chest, right through his corrupt heart. He looked down, a comical expression of surprise on his face, before he crumpled to the ground, dead. Aria pulled the spear free. She walked to his body and picked up the coiled whip he always carried at his belt, the one whose sting she knew so well. With a cry that was a release of a lifetime of pain, she brought it down over her knee, snapping the leather in two. It was done. Her past was dead. A stunned cheer rose from some of the crowd. In the chaotic celebration that followed, a feast was hastily arranged. Aria, still reeling, felt a hand on her arm. It was Kael. "You are magnificent," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. As he spoke, she saw it, a flicker of movement behind him. A courtier jostled, a hand raised, the glint of silver, the serpent hilt, her vision, the dagger. "Kael!" she screamed. The assassin lunged, the blade aimed for the king's back. There was no time to think. She moved, shoving him hard, putting her own body where he had just been. A searing, white-hot agony exploded in her side. The world dissolved into a smear of shocked faces and torchlight. She looked down and saw the dark wood handle of the dagger protruding from her ribs. Then she looked up, into Kael's horrified, widening eyes, before her legs gave out, and the world went black. Chapter 18. The king's shattering time stopped. One moment, the world was a cacophony of celebration, cheers, music, laughter. The next, there was only one sound, a soft, wet thud, and Aria's cry. Kael turned, his name a question on her lips, and saw her fall. He caught her before she hit the ground, his arms wrapping around a body that had suddenly gone limp. For a heartbeat, he didn't understand. He thought she had stumbled. Then he felt the warmth. It spread across his hands, thick and sticky. He looked down. Blood. So much blood. It was pouring from a wound in her side, staining the deep blue of her gown a sickening black in the torchlight. Protruding from the wound was a dagger, not just any dagger. The hilt was a silver serpent, its fangs biting its own tail. A sigil he knew, a crest belonging to a house that had sworn allegiance to his father's memory. The blade had been meant for him, for his back, and she had taken it. The world dissolved into a low, roaring hum in his ears. The faces around him became distorted masks of shock and horror. He could see their mouths moving, but he heard nothing but the frantic, panicked beat of his own heart. He looked down at Aria's face. Her skin was already turning a waxy, pale color. Her eyes fluttered, struggling to focus on him. "Kael," she whispered, a trickle of blood appearing at the corner of her lips. And in that single moment, his entire world shattered. The iron walls he had built around his heart, the cold logic of the king, the ruthless mask he had worn for years, it all turned to dust and blew away in a hurricane of pure, unadulterated agony. His rejection, his cruelty, his pathetic, self-serving attempts to protect her by pushing her away. What had it all been for? He had tried to sever their bond to keep her safe from his enemies, and in the end, she had died protecting him from them anyway. The irony was so profound, so hideously cruel, it stole the very breath from his lungs. He had been a fool. A blind, arrogant fool. He had seen her as a weakness to be hidden, a vulnerability to be excised. He had rejected the goddess's gift, spat in the face of fate, all because of a wound from his past he had been too cowardly to let heal. And this was his punishment. He was being forced to watch the only light in his desolate life extinguish, all because of his own pride. She wasn't his weakness. She was the only strength he had. She was the strategist who saw his flaws, the defiant spirit who was not afraid of him, the mate who had stepped in front of a blade meant for him. Her eyes drifted shut. Her breathing grew shallow. A low, guttural sound was torn from deep within his chest, a sound of absolute despair. It wasn't the roar of a king. It was the howl of a wolf that has lost its soul. He gathered her into his arms, oblivious to the chaos erupting around him, to the guards shouting, to the assassin being captured. None of it mattered. Nothing mattered but the dying woman in his arms. "Healers!" he roared, his voice finally breaking through the fog, a raw, desperate command. "Now!" He started running toward the castle, her lifeblood warm against his skin, his every step a prayer to a goddess he had forsaken. "Don't take her, don't you dare take her from me too." Chapter 19. The Turning Point. Awareness returned not as a sudden rush, but as a slow, painful tide. The first thing Aria felt was a dull, throbbing fire in her side. The second was a hand, large and warm, holding hers. She blinked, her eyelashes heavy, and the world swam into a blurry focus. She was in a vast bed, the linens softer than a cloud. Sunlight streamed through a high window, and sitting in a chair beside her, his head bowed over their joined hands, was Kael. He looked wrecked. A dark stubble shadowed his jaw. His face was gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept in days. He wasn't the cold, untouchable king. He was a man hollowed out by grief. He must have felt her stir because his head shot up. His stormy eyes, raw and bloodshot, met hers. Relief so profound it was almost painful washed over his features. "Aria," he breathed, his voice a broken, ragged thing. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "You're awake." She tried to speak, but her throat was dry. She managed a small nod. He was instantly at her side with a cup of water, his large hand surprisingly gentle as he helped her sip. He tended to her not like a king to a subject, but like something else entirely. Something precious. "How long?" she rasped. 4 days, he said, his voice thick with guilt. "You almost died. The healers. They said your will to live was the only thing that saved you." He sat on the edge of the bed, his gaze never leaving her face. "Aria, I need to. There are things you have to know. Truths I should have told you from the beginning." And then he told her everything. He spoke of Lyra, his first mate, and the ambush that had stolen her life. He confessed his terror of that pain, how it had convinced him that love was a fatal weakness. He told her about the moment he'd recognized her as his second chance, his true mate, and the blind panic that had followed. With a voice choked with self-loathing, he admitted to the rejection ritual, to the agony of severing a bond he was too cowardly to accept. "I was a fool," he whispered, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I thought I was protecting you by pushing you away. I broke my own soul, and all it did was leave you vulnerable. I left you alone to face a danger that was meant for me." He lowered his head in shame. She took a blade for a man who rejected her. Can you ever forgive me? Aria listened, the story filling in all the empty, painful spaces of the past weeks. She saw his cruelty not as malice, but as a desperate, misguided act of a man ravaged by grief. She reached out, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. He flinched, as if unworthy of her touch, but she held firm. The bond between them, reignited by that desperate kiss and now tempered by this raw confession, settled into something new. It was no longer a chaotic, confusing force. It was a deep, quiet hum of understanding, a foundation of truth. "There's nothing to forgive," she whispered. "We both have scars, Kael. It's time we stopped letting them rule us." Chapter 20. The Queen's Gambit. In the week that followed, Aria's body healed and her mind sharpened. Kael rarely left her side, their new fragile peace a quiet sanctuary in the heart of a kingdom simmering with intrigue. While the healers mended her flesh with poultices and potions, Aria's mind worked to mend the fractured pieces of the conspiracy against them. Kael brought her maps, correspondence, and security reports. He treated her not as a patient, but as his chief counsel, his war counsel. She spread the documents across the silken sheets of her bed. "It wasn't just an assassination attempt," she said one afternoon, her voice stronger now. "It was the first move in a coup." Kael listened, his expression grim, as she laid it all out. "Malachor is the serpent's head. He's been using your grief over Lyra for years, subtly isolating you, making you more reliant on his counsel. He made you believe fear was your only tool because it made you predictable." She pointed to a trade document. "He's been embezzling funds, using the money to buy the loyalty of ambitious lords, like Paradin. The serpent sigil is their mark of allegiance." Her finger traced a line on a map. "The plan was simple. The assassin kills you. The court descends into chaos. Your death is blamed on a border dispute, perhaps with my old pack, sparking a civil war. And who is there to restore order?" "Malachor," Kael finished, his voice a low growl of dawning fury. He would position himself as the steady hand, the regent, and eventually, the new king. "Exactly," Aria confirmed. "But he made one mistake. He didn't count on you having me." She looked up, her eyes clear and sharp. "And now we will use his own plan against him. We will spring his trap, but he will be the one caught inside it." Kael leaned forward, his focus entirely on her. "What do you propose?" "He thinks I am your greatest weakness," she said, a dangerous glint in her eyes. "We will make him believe it. You will call for a public judgment. For me." Kael's face darkened. "Aria, no. You've already been through one trial. This is not a trial of strength, Kael. It is a trial of truth," she insisted, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "You will put me on trial for endangering the king and consorting with known enemies, my former pack. It will force Malachor's hand. He will have to step forward as my chief accuser. He will present his evidence of my treachery to the court, and in doing so, he will expose his entire network, his lies, and his ambition to the entire kingdom. We won't just execute a traitor. We will dismantle his whole conspiracy in one move." It was a brilliant, terrifying gambit, a play so audacious, so daring, that no one would see it coming. Kael looked at her, at the fierce intelligence burning in her eyes, at the unyielding strength in the set of her jaw. He was not looking at an Omega. He was not looking at a scribe. He was looking at his queen. "Tell me what you need," he said, his voice filled with absolute, unwavering trust. The king was ready to follow her lead. Chapter 21, Setting the Trap. The royal proclamation echoed through the stone halls of the palace, read by heralds in every major courtyard and corridor. Aria Vale, the Omega scribe, was to stand for public judgment in the Great Hall in 2 days' time. The charges? High treason and conspiracy to assassinate the king. The castle erupted. It was a beehive kicked over, buzzing with frantic speculation and rumor. To most of the court, it was the inevitable grim conclusion to the Omega's brief and scandalous rise. The king, they whispered, had finally come to his senses. He was cutting out the cancer that had infected his court. Lord Malachor moved through the halls with a somber, self-righteous air, accepting condolences and whispered words of support for his role in saving the kingdom from her influence. He had no idea he was a fly, blissfully walking into the most intricate web he had ever encountered. Aria spent the 2 days in quiet preparation. She was moved back to her small, simple room from the grand healing chamber, a deliberate move to make her appear abandoned by the king. She ate the plain food of a prisoner. She met no one. Kael, playing his part perfectly, did not visit her. He was a storm cloud of fury and grief in public, a king betrayed, locking himself away in his study. The entire court was convinced he was heartbroken, but resolute. On the morning of the judgment, 2 guards came for her. They did not bind her hands. She walked between them, her head held high. She had chosen her attire with care. Not a prisoner's rags, but a simple, strong gown the color of burnished steel. It was the color of a sword. Her hair was not elaborately styled, but bound back in a simple, practical braid. She was not a victim going to her execution. She was a general walking onto the battlefield. Just before they reached the massive doors of the Great Hall, one of the guards, a man whose face she recognized as one of Kael's most loyal, pressed a small object into her hand. A scroll, tightly rolled and sealed. A quiet message of solidarity passed in his eyes. The final moment came. She stood before the doors, the low murmur of the entire assembled court audible from within. This was it. The culmination of her entire life, the years of abuse, the secret studies, the visions, the pain, the love. It all came down to what happened in the next hour. She felt a tremor of fear, a cold serpent coiling in her gut. Then, she felt something else. A warmth spreading through her chest, a hum of strength, of connection. It was the bond. Through the stone walls, through the distance, she could feel Kael, his strength, his trust, his love. It was a silent promise. I am with you. The fear did not vanish, but it was joined by a fierce, unyielding resolve. She was not alone. Straightening her shoulders, she gave the guards a sharp nod. The great oak doors groaned open, revealing the cavernous hall, packed to the rafters with every noble lord and warrior in the kingdom. At the far end, on his obsidian throne, sat the king, his face a mask of cold, unreadable judgment. The trap was set. It was time for the Queen's Gambit to begin. Chapter 22. The double-mark Aria stood in the center of the great hall, the silence a suffocating blanket. Every eye was on her. On one side stood the nobles, a sea of hostile, judging faces. On the other, the royal guard, their expressions unreadable. And on the throne, Kael watched, his face a mask of iron control, but his bond was a silent scream of support in her soul. Lord Malachor stepped forward, a roll of parchment in his hand. The evidence against this Omega is undeniable, he announced, his voice oozing self-righteous venom. He began to read, his accusations a twisted tapestry of half-truths and outright lies. He spoke of her secret meetings, her research in the library. He produced forged letters, supposedly from her to Jorik, plotting the king's demise. He painted a picture of a cunning, ambitious traitor who had bewitched their noble king. The court murmured, the seeds of doubt taking root. Malachor was a master manipulator, his performance flawless. Aria let him speak, let him weave his web of deceit. She stood perfectly still, her calm unnerving him more than any denial would have. When he was finished, a smug, triumphant smile touched his lips. What say you to these charges, Omega? Aria met his gaze. I say you are a fool, she said, her voice ringing with a power that stunned the hall into silence. "You accuse me of conspiracy, but you are the true traitor." She held up the small scroll the guard had given her. "This is not a letter. It is a copy of your private ledger, Lord Malachor. A detailed account of every coin you have stolen from the royal treasury to bribe greedy lords like Paradin to your cause." Malachor's face went white. Paradin and a dozen other nobles began to sweat. "You accuse me of wanting the king dead," Aria continued, her voice rising, a whip of righteous fury. "But it was your serpent sigil on the assassin's blade. You orchestrated the attack, hoping to kill the king and plunge this kingdom into a civil war, a war from which you intended to rise as the new Alpha." She let the scroll drop to the floor. "I did not endanger the king. I took a blade for him, a blade you sent." The truth, clear and undeniable, shattered Malachor's web. The nobles who were not part of his plot turned on him, their voices rising in a furious tide of accusation. The trap had sprung. Malachor, seeing it all collapse, drew a hidden dagger and lunged, not at Aria, but at the throne. He never made it. Kael moved in a blur of black, a shadow of lethal grace. There was a single swift motion, a flash of steel, and Lord Malachor's head tumbled from his shoulders, his expression of shock frozen on his face for eternity. Kael stood over the body, his sword dripping. The hall was deathly quiet. He turned to the court, his eyes blazing. The traitor is dead, but the matter of the Omega remains. A lord, bolder than the rest, called out, "What is her verdict, your majesty?" Kael sheathed his sword. He walked down the dais, not to the throne, but to her. He stopped in front of Aria, the entire world holding its breath. He looked into her eyes, his soul bare for her to see. Love. Awe. Absolute devotion. This was his verdict. This was his choice. In front of the entire kingdom, he lowered his head and sank his teeth into the juncture of her neck and shoulder. A searing, exquisite fire exploded through her, the claiming. The bond, already a living thing, now solidified into an unbreakable, eternal seal. He raised his head, his mark a proud, bleeding declaration on her skin. But as the court stared in stunned silence, Aria did something no one in the history of their people had ever done. She reached up, tangled her hands in his hair, and pulled his head back down. Then, with a fierce, possessive love that mirrored his own, she sank her teeth into his neck, marking him as her own. An equal. A partner. A wave of pure, white-hot energy erupted from them, a visible shockwave that made the very stones of the castle tremble. The Omega had marked the king. Chapter 23. The Crown of Scars' Silence. Not the tense, waiting silence from before, but a profound, shell-shocked stillness. The court stared, their minds unable to process what they had just witnessed. The double mark, a thing of myth, a bond of perfect equals. So powerful it had rewritten the ancient laws of their world in a single searing moment. The air around Aria and Kael thrummed with a palpable energy, a golden aura that was both terrifying and beautiful. Kael raised his head, a trickle of his own blood running down his neck from her bite. He didn't look angry. He looked complete. He turned to face the stunned nobles, his arm circling Aria's waist, pulling her to his side. They stood together, not as king and subject, but as two halves of a single, formidable whole. "You have asked for a verdict," Kael's voice boomed, filled with a new, resonant power. "You have questioned her place. You have doubted her worth." He looked down at Aria, his gaze filled with a reverence that silenced all dissent. "You have witnessed her mind, which outthought a traitor. You have seen her strength, which defeated a champion. You have felt her heart, which tamed a beast and took a blade for her king. She is not my Omega. She is not my pet." He paused, letting his words sink in. "She is your queen." He led her to the dais, not to the foot of the throne, but to stand beside it. He summoned the keeper of the royal regalia. An ancient, trembling wolf brought forth a heavy iron crown, the one worn by ruling kings for 1,000 years. Kael took it. But he did not place it on his own head. He turned and gently, reverently, placed it upon Aria's. The cold, heavy weight settled on her brow. It felt right. It was not a prize she had been given. It was a mantle she had earned. It was a crown forged not from gold and jewels, but from her scars, her intellect, and her defiance. She looked out at the sea of faces. She saw the shock, the fear, and in the eyes of many, a dawning, grudging respect. They were not looking at an Omega anymore. They were looking at a power they had never imagined. Aria's gaze found the royal guard who had given her the scroll. He was the first. He dropped to one knee, his head bowed. Then another guard followed. Then a lord. And then another. Soon, the entire hall was kneeling. They knelt before the ruthless Alpha King, and before the Omega who had claimed his heart, his kingdom, and his soul. She stood tall, the crown on her head, the king by her side, the great black wolf from the woods now curled protectively at her feet. She was no longer a servant hiding in the shadows. She was a sovereign, standing in the light, and her reign was just beginning. Chapter 24. A Destiny Revealed. The royal chambers were quiet, the only sound the soft crackle of a fire in the hearth. The weight of the crown was gone, replaced by the comforting weight of Kael's arm around her as they lay in the massive bed. The ruthless king was gone, too. In his place was a man whose stormy eyes were soft with a tenderness she was beginning to realize was reserved for her alone. He traced the lines of the faded scars on her back, his touch gentle, as if trying to heal wounds that were years old. "Does it hurt?" he murmured, his voice a low rumble against her ear. He meant the new mark on her neck, a proud, permanent symbol of his claim. "No," she whispered, turning in his arms to face him. She reached up and lightly touched the matching mark on his own neck. "Does yours?" A slow smile spread across his lips, transforming his harsh features. "It is the only wound I have ever welcomed." He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. "The kingdom is in chaos. The old laws are broken. The other packs will have questions. And we will answer them," she said, her voice filled with a calm certainty. "Together." The word hung in the air between them, a promise. Together. It was all they needed. He kissed her then, a slow, deep kiss that was not about possession or desperation, but about peace, about finding home. She drifted to sleep in his arms, feeling safer, more whole than she ever had in her life. And she dreamed. She was standing in a field of silver moonlight. The grass beneath her feet was soft as velvet, and the air hummed with a gentle cosmic energy. A figure walked toward her. Not a wolf, but a woman made of starlight and shadow, her face kind and ancient, her eyes holding the wisdom of 1,000 full moons. "You have done well, my daughter," a voice whispered, not in her ears, but directly in her soul. It was the moon goddess. I don't understand," Aria stammered, awestruck. "What am I?" "You were never an Omega," the goddess said, her voice like the rustle of celestial winds. "That was a label of men, a cloak to hide you until you were ready. Your mother's bloodline is one of my oldest gifts. The mind of the strategist, the heart of the empath, the eye of the seer. It is the bloodline of the fulcrum, the wolf who brings balance." "And Kael?" Aria asked, her heart aching for him even in this dream. "He is the bloodline of the sword. Power, strength, and unwavering will. For generations, the sword has been without its balance, and the world has suffered for it. I sent him Lyra to soften his father's cruelties, but fate was twisted by the hands of traitors. His heart was shattered, and he became a sword with no hand to guide it, only a weapon of fear." The goddess smiled, a gentle, luminous expression. "But I do not make mistakes. I only wait. I waited for the sword to be ready, and I waited for the fulcrum to be strong enough to bear his weight." "The double mark," Aria whispered. "It is a sign that the balance is restored. the goddess confirmed. You were not chosen to be a king's mate. You and Kael were chosen to rewrite the fate of all wolves, to lead them into a new era where strength is not just in the bite, but in the bond, where power is not just held, but shared. Aria woke with the first light of dawn, the dream as real as the steady beat of Kael's heart against her back. She looked at the sleeping king beside her, his face peaceful for the first time. They were more than Alpha and Omega, more than king and queen. They were a beginning, and their story was just getting started.